Well, we're about to meet a team of two men who've had various nicknames throughout their combined 60 years of experience in the investment industry, but their current collaboration as co-founders of Rethinking Choices puts them into Batman and Robin territory. Their transformational ownership proposal is a market solution to transform fossil fuels into stewardship and provide ethical clarity for all actors, governments, asset owners and investors, businesses and individuals. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome Crusaders David Coe and Richard Busellato. I was trying so hard to get it right, of Rethinking Choices, who will talk us through their ideas and welcome any questions from any of you. But first of all, guys, welcome. And I want to ask you a question before I hand over to you. I'm not sure which one of you is Batman and which one is Robin, by the way.
Neither
Um,
do we.
No, I
but
think we're both Robin.
you are, well, I don't know. I haven't met you in person, so I'm not sure we'll have to decide on that. And neither of you turned up with a cape, though one of you, and I shall not say who, has told me that you have dressed up as Batman and Robin before now. So I expect to see this when I actually meet you in person. Now, it feels like I'm doing all of this because it does feel like you're on a crusade with this proposal, which does beg one question straight away. Who are you pursuing with this proposal, or who are you hoping is going to be the key element which brings around the social equilibrium within investing without changing the fundamental purpose of an industry, which is all about making money? So I don't know which one of you wants to answer, but away you go.
I'm edging eager, charged to go along and throw in my tuppence worth of an answer. But thank you very much, first of all, for having us over here to do this, and high praises, and I hope what we'll talk about will justify it. But really, this is reaching out, as the symposium is about. It's really responsible investors, responsible asset owners, and businesses. And what it's basically saying is not enough just to think about what we ourselves do, but we all have to contribute. We all have to contribute basically a kind of a climate charge. And that's what we're reaching out to. So all you chief executives out there, or you chairmen of boards, chief investment officers, and all the people out there, that's who we're talking to.
Okay, well, on that basis, I'm going to hand over to you. I'm going to zoom out, but I'll be listening to you. So away you go.
Okay. So I'm going to start by sharing screen, sharing presentation. There we go. Richard?
Yes, thank you very much for having us here. David and I are Rethinking Choices, something we started out about a year ago or so, after having spent 30 years each in the investment industry, working for hedge funds, financial institutions, and banks, etc. We are long-term veterans with extensive investment knowledge, and we met about 5 years ago when I joined the fund David was working for at the time, and we started digging in a lot more into sustainable investing and sustainability as an issue. And all those ideas eventually ended up in a book called The Unsustainable Truth, where we elaborated a bit more on some of the ideas and some of the thinking you will be hearing about here today.
And we want to start basically, we all have our day jobs and we all want to be responsible in what we do. And sustainable investment is now about a third of investment assets. And recently, Bloomberg had an article that said it's going to top 50 trillion by 2025. But the problem with it is actually it's not enough about what we do. And like to tell stories, made up stories. So this is entirely hypothetical. But hopefully illustrates the point of what we're trying to say. And which is that, you're supposing that you live in a flat and in front of it is a beautiful garden. And kids play in it, people use it for exercise. And when you come home from work, you take a moment to pause, just to, take a breath, recollect yourself before you go and join the family in the evening. Now, someone in these blocks of flats that surround this garden gets an idea and thinks, actually, you know what? It's a beautiful space. We can use it. We can do a sustainability event. And they work for a company, and the company sponsors it. And in order to make sure that it's only good, you make sure that there are no plastics, or the food is vegan, everybody comes to it by public transport or they walk. And it turns out to be a really successful event. Then what happens along is some other people seeing this and think, that's a really good thing to do. So they go along and host another one, and eventually all this built into movement, a kind of gardens for sustainability thing. And it's all fantastic, all very good. New apps come out, people get engaged in it, and it spreads to other gardens. But gradually, what happens is that the gardens get busy and the kids stop playing in it. People stop using the exercise. When you come home, maybe 3 evenings out of 5, there's something going on. And you can no longer take that breath just to recollect yourself. And those are the kind of impacts that as we go on and try to do what we think is right, everybody joins in and does it. And the result is always, inevitably, we end up using more capacity than there is. And the story of our sustainability and the problems with our sustainability, and most importantly, the problems of investments, is about that collective impact of everybody wanting to do good, but without being aware of how to make sure we don't go beyond the capacity of the planet.
So when we started looking into this, we were frankly quite staggered by the numbers that are involved. And the world now has well in excess of $100 trillion of various savings pools, mostly pensions, rainy day investments, and collective schemes of various forms. And the problem when you get to this amount of money in a finite place like the world ultimately is that you start financializing everything and you do things basically only for profit. And the numbers become so large that eventually the planet cannot really cope with our demand for this return. Because even though the pool of assets is very, very large, the planet could perhaps cope quite well with that. But what we are demanding in return is simply too much. And if you believe we have a sustainability problem, it's because resources are limited. So what works on an individual level does not work on the collective level because, like we said, it's simply too much. So the simple investment maths for an individual, and here we're using the UK as an example, is where the median salary is £30,000. You are now mandated to save 8% of that towards your pension, partially through you, partially through your employer. And you are supposed to be working for 30 years. And after that, spending 30 years in retirement. And the OECD stipulates that the poverty level living, which surely no one in retirement really wants to end up in, is 60% of the median earnings in the country. So when people do this maths, and we fundamentally don't think people are stupid, consciously everyone is well aware of what is required for you to have a comfortable or a reasonably comfortable retirement, is that you need to find a way of turning £72,000, which is your lifetime contributions, into £540,000, because that will be drawn down over 30 years. And not totally surprisingly, this equates to 10% return each and every year over your whole working life. And 10% is simply too much.
What it means out of the investment assets we have is that we're seeking more than 11 trillion in profits just for our investment portfolios. So if you think about what our businesses do, so if you're a CEO out there, you are chairman of board and you're overseeing some major business, what you're doing is you're trying to provide wages, you're trying to pay taxes, you're trying to make money for your business development costs, and you're trying to look after everybody else in the world. That basically is where all the money comes from. And on top of all of that, we still need 11 trillion just so that we can grow our investments. And so when it's looking for that much money, and when what we call as sustainable is just simply not sustainable. And whenever that we run into problems, we try and find our way out of it. And when we do that, we aren't really aware of the total impact of what we do. Think back to that story of the garden that we have at the beginning. Everybody's doing their bit, but actually nobody sees what the total is really happening. And this chart here came out at the beginning of this year. It's a repeat of a chart that first started in, I think it was about 2015. It's called the Planetary Boundaries. And this year was updated. And there are 9 zones in there. 5 of them are in the red. They represent where we have broken through what is safe for the planet. Now, at about 11 o'clock is climate change. And if you look at it, it's actually the least in the red. But what's really important about it is that the thing that has led us to be able to get into the red there, the fossil fuels we use, is also the things that have led to all the other things. Because cheap energy means we can do more. So if you look over to the right, to the left at about 9 o'clock, what you see is land system change. That's the next more extended one. There is the fact that as we do more, we need mineral resources. We need to start mining more. And then when we start mining more, we change the land from where it was. And then we start building villages and roads. And then we start actually having to plant more crops for those villages and roads. And before we know it, the whole look of the land and everything has changed. That takes us to a little bit further up along the chart to about 10 o'clock, where what you see is basically the problems with the species of animals, the animals and plants we have. They're diminishing. And they're diminishing because we're doing more things and we're planting more crops. And so we're taking out the natural sort of crops. We're making more buildings and we're taking out the spaces for those. And at the bottom, what you see is what are called biochemical flows. They are things like the fertilizers we put on the land, the nitrate fertilizers, which also come from fossil fuels, and the phosphate fertilizers. And those are the things that we need in order to keep the crops up. But most worrying is the one at about 1 o'clock. They're called novel entities. And these are basically things that weren't in the planet, say, at the time of dinosaurs, but that we have introduced into our atmosphere, into our soil, into our rivers. And they are essentially all the unintended consequences of using technology in the past. Because every time we deploy our technology, we do it in order to try and do some good. We never do it to create harm. It's only the unintended consequences. And that's the problem that we have. And if we think today, we talk a lot about the circular economy. Well, circular economy sounds very nice, but the problem is when you're looking for something like a 10% growth, you always need more. So here's an example. You're a bottler, you make 10 bottles a year. This year you made 10 bottles. Next year you want to make 20. You recycle all 10 bottles, you still need material for another 10. At some point you want to make 40. So you recycled all the 20 bottles, you now need more materials for another 20. And so it goes on. And the result is that if you want to make 10% return, it's totally incompatible with what we think a circular or recycling economy or recycling can actually provide. And the result of it is that we are going to run out into limits. And when we start off with electrification, electric vehicles, we find that in 2019, Bolivia had a military coup over, largely, people were saying, over lithium resources. And in response to that, what you end up with is Elon Musk making a tweet saying, we'll coup whoever we want, deal with it. It's not so much him, it's the fact that we all now think lithium resources are for the greater good, that we don't actually care how we're going to come about getting it. And if we do care about how we're going to get it, we're not going to get that 10 times return Tesla made in 2021. And we choose depending on what we want. Richard?
So what we see time and time again is actually that even really good intentions become corrupted and lead to unintentional harm because there is simply too much money involved. And this is a huge dilemma as an investment manager, because you're very regulated and you're supposed to go for the best possible return according to your fiduciary responsibility. And it's also very, very hard for you to justify not investing, to not deploy the capital you have under your care. But what is infinitely true, and I think everyone managing money has experienced this, is when you get more capital, it becomes more difficult to find same quality opportunities, because ultimately the world is not infinite and you run out of kind of genuine opportunities in how you're going to deploy your capital. And what that leads to is that you start investing and straying away into areas where you should never have gone in the first place, because these were assets that actually are fundamentally unsuited for investments. But you have no other choice because the capital you have under your care overwhelms the actual opportunities the planet is providing for you. And one such example is microfinance, where very small amounts of capital did an awful lot of good in places that were completely inaccessible to traditional finance. But when we saw it doing good, and we actually also saw that you could get quite good returns from microfinance, we overwhelmed the whole space with capital, which led to a lot of unintended consequences and lumbered people with lifelong debts, because actually there weren't that many genuine opportunities in areas with relatively poor living standards. So we need to be incredibly careful about the harm we can cause just because we are so eager to deploy that capital we have been allocated. And for us, responsible investing, more than anything else, is essentially being honest to your investors about what kind of returns you can deliver without hurting the place we're living on. You need to respect the planetary limitations we have. And that's not necessarily easy to do, but education helps. And telling people and being honest about what you can actually achieve without starting doing kind of crazy things. And it also puts somewhat traditional theory into a new space, because mean variance and efficient frontiers and Markowitz theories all assumes that you can access and lever off whatever the opportunities are. But both operational and financial leverage in this space, when you assume that the world is infinite, means that you're ultimately leveraging the climate and nothing else. So being honest with your investor about what are the kind of returns you can achieve without causing harm is the very best place to start if you're a responsible investor.
And that takes us to the climate elephant in the room. And the point is, of course, that you're in a room and there's an elephant in there, but nobody talks about it. Well, we all talk about it, but we all talk about it in a way that promotes what it is that we can do, either as an investor or as a business in our path, whether we talk about our net zero plan or decarbonization plan, our portfolio having no fossil fuels in it, or our portfolios being involved in all the impact investing and all those things about it. The big problem is what we actually need to talk about is what do we actually do with fossil fuels, because they need to be put into stewardship. And that's what the rest of this presentation we're going to ask you for your help is to do that. First, Richard's going to explain some of the basic facts.
So we've seen the planetary limitation chart and how many of these areas are under severe strain. But the most pressing issue facing our planet today is the carbon budget. And the reason is that the runway is relatively short before we run into irreversible damage. And here are some numbers. We emitted 39 gigatons of carbon dioxide last year. And if we're hoping to cut down on that emission by 2.5%, i.e. 1 gigaton, it is the equivalent of taking Germany offline, because that is how much Germany emits in a year. And if we think we can repeat this exercise for 39 years consecutively and cut 1 gigaton of emissions each and every year, which is incredibly hard because you can only take Germany offline once, and the next year you need to find someone else to stop emitting, we would have breached the carbon budget substantially for the 1.5 degree target, because we only have 420 gigatons left, and we would have emitted 760 gigatons by cutting it by 39 per year for 39 years. And the reason that it's so incredibly hard to cut it down is that fossil fuels essentially power most of the things we do. They provide in excess of 80% of our energy. And we are trying hard to replace this with a lot of renewables. But it's worth remembering here that 83% of the primary energy is fossil fuel. So even though we have built up an enormous capacity of renewables that have far exceeded any forecast we made 5 or 10 years ago, we are still using more fossil fuels this year than we did last year. and we're using pretty much more fossil fuels each and every year than we did the year before. And these are the projections between now and 2050 by EIA, which is most credible source for these kind of forecasts. And this is their central case scenario, where we can see a green line of renewables going very rapidly higher, and will do so all the way to 2050. But despite us using so much effort to get renewables into our system, none of the fossil fuels are actually declining in their use, except for coal over the next couple of years. And that is why it's so hard to cut the carbon dioxide emissions, because all of these are activities that generate growth. And it's essentially what we have, an economic model that is striving for. And we see it as the only possible solution is actually to limit the supply of fossil fuels if you're going to take decarbonization seriously and hope that we can stick to our heating targets of 1.5 degrees.
So the basic story, just to kind of summarize a bit to get our thoughts together, is that we all want to think about a world where we don't need fossil fuels, but fossil fuels provide so much of our energy. If we even just take 2.5% of it off, we basically need to take something like the whole of the energy that Germany uses offline. And we try and think about replacing that with renewables quickly. That's equivalent to 1.5 times the total amount of renewable energy that Europe used over 2020. And we need to keep doing that every year. And the real situation is we're not going to do it, not without some way of actually constraining our use of energy and make us really focus on where we're using energy and whether that is most important. And for that, what we have is an idea of what we call a transformational ownership. Now, a lot of people already recognize that fossil fuels are not suitable investment assets, and funds have been divesting from it. The big problem is who's buying it. Because the person who buys it from someone who's divesting is a person who wants it for the economic gains and wants to keep using it. So what the proposal is to create a single global fund, which becomes a transformational ownership fund. And it's transformational because it changes our ideas of fossil fuel assets and it transforms everything else that goes on after that. So what does it do? It commits, first of all, to reducing fossil fuel production by following guidance from science. So we call the IPCC and we say just how much do we need to reduce and how, and give us some guidance and let us know. And what it does importantly is what's going on at the moment as we see fossil fuels being restricted. Prices go up, people get hurt. Where do you want that money to go to? Well, first of all, you need the price to go up in order to stop us from driving our cars as frequently as we can. But then you need to give that money out to support people all around the world. And that, once you do that, create a whole different class of fossil fuel producers. They're entirely ethical in the sense that all the money from it goes to support people in local projects, and it supports the planet and its environment by cutting the fossil fuel production. And that allows you to then create a virtuous circle where you can go to the producers who don't commit to that and start saying, you need to be sanctioned and you need to be boycotted. And if we want to look at what's going on in the world at the moment, the reality is climate change is already impacting things and it's already hurting people in its different ways. And we don't have to wait for the sea levels to rise. And it's hurting the rich world. Last year, insurance losses totaled a huge amount, 130 billion. And if we think about what that means, it means that all the things which we are used to as the richer people who can afford to be investing is put at risk because the actual glue that holds our economy together is being put at risk by excessive insurance losses. And that kind of aspect of it, perspective, is not really spoken of. But there is more reason to that for looking after people first. And that's simply because whatever our ambitions towards our net zero and so on is, we may or may not achieve those, but that should not hold us back from taking the money from the fossil fuel industry and deploying them to help people. And there, what we need to do is to put aside the belief that somehow we know what's best and actually go and accept that people in their local communities facing the issues that they face know best what it is that they need. And that's why we can use the 110 billion dividends that fossil fuel producers gave to investors last year and actually use that money to support local projects without any judgment that people simply nominate from where they are. And if you look to around the world and you think about what that 110 billion means, that's basically $14 per child, woman, and man in the world. If you look around the world and you think about what that means, in Somalia, they live on about 70 cents a day, Burkina Faso, $2. And if you go to the US, you have $150 a day, in the UK, $120. And of course, if you actually live in the UK, as I do, and Richard, or if you live in the US, you say you never spend $100 a day. So where's that money? Why is it like that? It's because we have fantastic infrastructure. We have roads which are all tarred. We have street lights. We have schools and all of those things. And in Somalia or even Thailand and Burkina Faso, you don't have the same level of that. And that's what local projects allow people to have, is the kind of infrastructure that has a community that can help them to facing the challenges that they do. Now, it all sounds like a big task ahead, and can we do it? And this is where we come to, and we actually say it's actually quite easy if you want to put your mind to it. And the reason is because fossil fuel producers are valued at just over 2 trillion. But last year, the companies in the MSCI World Index gave back 1.2 trillion in dividends to their investors. So as responsible asset owners, you are the people who receive this money. This money represented just 1.7% of the 19% total return the index gave you. So if you only accepted 17%, that would produce enough money available without impacting the operational cost of the companies that we all invest in and we need them to carry on operating, to go and buy up the majority of the fossil fuel producers, to be able to exercise an ownership right to say, let's commit to managing our fossil fuels as a stewardship asset so that we get guidance from science as to how to reduce it. And we use all the money that comes to shareholders from the industry to support people all around the world in local projects. And once you do that, you can call on the businesses to contribute, you can call on the investors to contribute, you can all be then recognized as looking after that big picture, so that when we go and put out our decarbonization plan, we are not like the people advocating a sustainability project in that garden I spoke about right at the beginning, and not really caring whether there's so many activities that ultimately we end up using more and more fossil fuels and destroying the land that we want to protect. Because we're actually putting a limit onto what it is that ourselves and anyone else can do. And that's what responsible ownership requires us. And once we're willing to do that, we can then extend that virtuous circle, and that's why it becomes very transformative. Governments can then be called on and say, look at what we've done with these companies, ask these companies, and look at the ones who hold out against us. And we can call on people and say, go and convince them that this is what they need to do, because what they advocate by itself is not enough. We still have to have some way to look after the whole thing. And that's what this stand does, and allows that transformational aspect to complete. So what does this mean for us? Well, first of all, it's very important that this is talked about at the highest level. So what we want you to do is, if this seems like a good idea, and it seems like an idea that's worth following on, then what we want you to do is take it up, so that we can talk to the CEOs, talk to the chairman of the board, talk to the chief investment officers and the people who run all the businesses and say, we need to put up money in order to be able to put our fossil fuels into stewardship. Because until we do that, we can do all the best we can, but what will happen is we will end up increasing our emissions without anyone intending it that way. And at the end of the day, we have to ask, what are we doing this for? And in that way, what I want to do is to think about what will our grandchildren's grandchildren say. And this is right across the world. And whether they're someone's grandchild in Somalia, or whether they're in US, or whether they're in Asia, wherever they may be, will they say about us that we taught them how to live, that we taught them about the meaning of what it means to put some money up, not for ourselves, but so that we can manage it for the future.
Thank you very much. We hope you've enjoyed our presentation and it's given you more than some food for thought. And if you go to our homepage, you can see who's looking after the big picture, which is essentially a little bit more extensive presentation of what you heard today. And we also hope that you will enjoy reading our book and getting our book, where we elaborate a lot more on these ideas around what sustainability and living in a world with limited resources means. Thank you.
Guys, well, I say thank you, but actually I don't know whether I want to cry or smile or what. So what you've said, what I've heard you say is that we live in this beautiful world. Humanity has developed this amazing technology. We can send a man to the moon. And the old joke goes, if you can send one man to the moon, why don't you send them all there? But anyway, so we can send men to the moon. We have created a new source of energy in a number of different ways. But that innovation and that creativity and that drive to evolve and to do more is actually the thing which is causing us the problem. But you want us to unpeel that, but to still use the creativity to create the new future that we want. So it's a kind of, you're asking people to split their personalities, really. And I'm not sure, is that just wildly optimistic?
Perhaps.
I mean, yeah, we're going to take in turn to answer. So I'll add a little bit. And I just want to say actually that we use so much energy at the moment each year. We can send about 2 billion Saturn V rockets to the moon.
With as many men as you like, right?
It's
Can I give you a list?
So we can actually send everybody to the moon with the amount of energy we're using.
Yeah, but I mean, all joking aside, you get the point that I'm making.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
Humanity, by its very nature, naturally has evolved from caveman, from ape man to caveman to where we are now. And what we're saying is, we want you to abandon all of that, really, and just say that this natural evolution is inevitably causing the problems, which you're then going to have to find another solution to fix. But by the way, we don't want you to keep using that creativity because it's got unintended consequences. So there are so many areas that you have to peel back in that, not least of is the characteristics of human nature to strive and to want and to see a nice car and a nice house and a nice whatever, and to do whatever it takes to get that. So isn't this an impossible dream?
It's actually exactly calling on that innovation and imagination that we have, which allows us to carry on in what we do, but recognizing that actually there is a finite limit. So what the proposal does is to say, let's all contribute a bit to make us really recognize that this finite limit is there. And once we can do that, we can allow our innovation run. And that's why Richard and I, with our 30 years of experience each within investing, actually see this as the greatest value generation opportunity. Because what will come out of that is a way in which we'll innovate, not simply by doing what's the easiest, but by doing what can be most permanent.
But you know, on a personal level, I believe in everything that you're saying, but then my business isn't driven by the returns that I give to the people who've given me their money to invest. And so you're asking the people who are judged by that to forego the benefit they get of delivering those returns and do something for the greater good of humanity, when there are so many things wrong in this world. And we're very aware of the current situation, obviously. And you're saying, well, despite all the things that other people are doing wrong, we want you to be the good guy. It's like your parents saying to you, You don't want to go out with Johnny or Mary or whatever, because they'll lead you astray and want you to be the good girl, and you still did it. You still, well, obviously I didn't, but some people still do the wrong thing. So it's a big ask. What I'm saying is that it's not just a series of actions which is difficult to take, it's a mindset. And that mindset, it didn't get there overnight, and therefore changing it isn't going to be an overnight thing either.
It's not going to be overnight. And Richard, I mean, this is really very portfolio.
I have to agree with everything you're saying, but beyond that, there is also a portfolio problem. There really is. And people don't readily acknowledge this, that if you're true to your fiduciary responsibility, you should look after your investors' money at all times, at all costs, and protect it. And if we don't get ahead of the carbon budget and we let it be breached, like we're forecasted to do at the moment, you're actually not dealing with your fiduciary responsibility when you could have done something, because you think you're running a good portfolio with a lot of diversification and hedges. But actually, climate risks, you cannot diversify them, you cannot hedge them, and you can certainly not divest them, because we're living only in this place. So you will find that all correlations starts increasing as the climate cost really is being felt, not only by people living, but by financial portfolios. So the best thing you can do when you're facing a portfolio problem, which is, in this case, the carbon budget, just deal with it immediately. Try to get ahead of it before the rest of your portfolio gets impaired, because this will affect everything you own, even if you think you're a smart guy or girl and you're running a well-balanced, well-diversified portfolio. It's like everything's going to be impaired here.
But who do we ask to really pull all this together? Because there are a lot of strands in this, and there are a lot of actors involved in it. There is governments, and you talked about it, governments, investors, fund owners, fund managers, everybody. Who do we say, where does the buck stop, and who says, okay, I forget about your individual concerns, forget about where you're at in your understanding about climate change and how big this planet is and how limited it is. You have to do this now, because let's say we don't all decide to do the right thing at the right time, or collectively. Who do you go to first of all? What's the chain of action to cause the effect that you want to achieve?
Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to set up an investment fund, basically, that can pull this money in. And this is a very classic thing that a passive fund does. Essentially, it's going to buy fossil fuel companies, it's going to use shareholder action empowered by ownership to be able to reach into the governance of the company. And as a shareholder, it's going to receive the income, it's going to distribute it to local projects. So it's exactly the same thing as what an investment done with the fund does with dividends. It comes in, distributes out to its own actual final owners, except now these goes to local projects, and everything else mimics that in that way. So you want to go along. Now, if you go to an investment company who normally sets up these funds, they will only set up the fund when they see that people are willing to put money in. So what you therefore need to do is you go along and you look, for example, Mike Cannon-Brookes in Australia, who was saying, I'm going to buy up AGL and convert its coal business and actually shut it down. So there are already people looking to having those actions. Engine number one in the US, many other people around. So you're basically saying, look, these are the examples of people who are willing to put up money. And so if you are a company and if you are an investor and you've thought about these sort of things, come along, do that. There are plenty of retail investors who hold fossil fuel assets that we've spoken to who says, what do I do with this? I don't really want to sell it just like that, but I don't know who to sell it to. I would be even willing to donate it if you give me someone who's going to look after it. So there's plenty out there already. So we just need them to raise a voice to the investment firm and say, create the fund and we'll give you the assets. And then you can get going.
I think you're talking about the sticky effect, aren't you? And a momentum where one or several people lead it, just as Al Gore has led the understanding about climate change in many, many ways. Not that he was the only one ever talking about it, but it took somebody like that to do it. And so how do you get that sticky effect? How do you, is it just you you two doing your Batman and Robin thing and going out there and telling everybody about it, or how do we get the word out there more easily? And by the way, I'm going to ask for those slides, and we'll have them for people. If it's okay with you, we'd like to make them available for people to have a look at and download themselves.
Absolutely, and in that way, obviously, we are willing to do everything we can, and we're doing this entirely independently. We don't have any support or anything, because actually what we want everybody to recognize is this is something that everybody should consider and do. And that's why we talked at the beginning about who are we speaking to at the moment here in being with you at this point, is to say, help us to reach into those chief executives, into the chairman of the boards, into the thought leaders that we have around, and say, let's bring this about together. I mean, our ambitious dream is we go along and we do a global event in the 12th of June, which is a Sunday, and think of a 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, where you start in the East on the 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. You have a live event which is streamed around, and you go around the world on a gentle 2 o'clock on the Sunday afternoon until you get all the way back round into Alaska.
You are fundamentally talking about a live aid for investment, really, aren't you? That it brings in all the continents together.
Yes, and crowdfunding for businesses to go and bring money in.
That's not a bad idea. And maybe that's something that should be done, to put money into it, to do a bit of crowdfunding for the big fund that we're talking about. But we are at different stages around the world. So this event is for APAC. We started in Europe, and then we went on to the Americas. And I learned an awful lot along the way, which is that Europe is at a vastly different place to the Americas, North and South America, and differences there. APAC is in another dimension altogether. Culturally different, politically different, engaged in an entirely different way. So we have China, which is the largest greenhouse gas emitter, uses more coal than anyone else, doesn't really want the West telling it what to do, quite rightly and quite understandably. How do you deal with something like that?
It's really important, because what happens in China is there are thousands of coal companies. And it's the lifeblood of local economies. You can't go along and turn off the lifeblood of vast amounts of population, which isn't exactly the same as they don't care. They care very much. And what happens as a transformational ownership fund is that you bring in all of the expertise from around the world. And then you can then actually help them with the expertise that they may not be able to have access to. So where you have smaller companies which finds it harder, unlike the larger, more majors, to actually have access to all the expertise and things, you can actually go along with that. And the essence of what this whole idea is, it brings collaboration together. It's not trying to say you're wrong or bad for dealing in fossil fuels, because we need it. If we cut it off, we'll be in real trouble. We actually need it. But actually that you can be part of a stewardship of the planet. But for you to be able to do that, we need to help you where you'd like us to help. So again,
yeah, I was going to say, Richard, what would you say, though, if somebody just took it down to the financials and said, but it's about returns? It is about delivering the returns that people need for their pensions, for their savings, for their investments, to put their kids in university and live their life. And it's about leveling up the playing field so that somebody in India has the same opportunity as somebody in the States. And you asking me to do this, you're asking me to do a philanthropic thing. What are my returns going to be like if I do contribute to this great big fund?
Well, they will be obviously somewhat less as you make a contribution, but it's important to remember we're essentially asking to take this money out of various corporates around the world. And you can think of it as being a sustainability fee for being in business. You are all using the planet, so you should all contribute towards being part of the planet. And what it does more than anything else, it totally removes any kind of accusation of greenwashing. Because if you're a corporation, you put this money up, you are serious about not greenwashing. And you're saying, this is my check for using planet Earth as my playground and my ability to sell goods or services. So you definitely do away with that accusation. And we know that the court of public opinion is pretty ruthless with people that don't play by the rules. So I'm fairly sure that initially, when you get a few of the larger corporations in the world to sign up to this and make a reasonable donation towards the fund, it's going to be very hard for the competitors to say, we don't want to be part of this, because where is your sustainability policy, really?
So fundamentally, yeah, you're trying to use competitive to drive people up to the top rather than taking it down to the bottom.
Absolutely. And with regards to returns, it's really is the long haul. If we can't deal with this over the next decade or whatever we have left of the carbon budget, which at the moment looks like 8 to 10 years, depending on how you calculate, after that, financial returns will be very, very secondary, because life will simply become unaffordable for the richer world, which paradoxically we think will be harder hit than the poorer world, because people in poorer areas are more resilient, and in richer areas probably a bit more complacent about the necessities and the basics of life. But
I was going to say, I think the expectation about what basics are in the West is entirely different. It was interesting through COVID, we had glorious weather, we had Netflix on time, we've got plenty of food and whatever. People said, this is such a terrible thing, it's like living in the war. Kind of went, no, I don't think you've lived in a war. I don't think if you think that's living in a war that you've lived in a war. So let's, I need to bring this to an end. So just give me one thing, both of you, each of you, that you would ask viewers watching this to do, who are obviously going to download your slides. What's the one thing you'd ask them to do to bring this about and bring it about quickly?
You want to start, Richard?
No, you start.
Okay, well,
I'm figuring out the answer.
well, definitely, get this proposal, get this idea up to the people who run the businesses, whether it's a construction business, an agricultural business, or an investment business. Get it up to them. Get this idea that we all use the planet as part of our playing field. There has to be a sustainability charge. And if we all put it together, you can do it once and it'll be done. Yeah. And it will generate money to look after people from that point on.
Richard.
I can only echo David, and I'll see it very much in a risk management perspective. As portfolio manager, I started when I was 22 managing money. The one thing you learn through your career is whenever you're facing a problem, the sooner you deal with it, the cheaper it is, and the better your overall return will be. There is just no real reason for putting off the inevitable, and we need to deal with this.
Yeah, I think that's probably the takeaway, is that whether you engage in it or not, it is going to be happening. So, you decide which side of it you want to be on. Do you want to wait till it happens to you, and you being you, your family, your environment, or do you want to be in there and start bringing about the change that we need to see? Gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure to listen to you. Well, I say that, it's been a bit depressing, but really useful to hear what you've got to say. I'm very grateful that you've taken time for this. Thank you for letting us share your slides. And I hope I hear from you again about the huge progress that you're making in future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.